Welcome to Kinship Cafe, everybody. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad you could join us today. And we are continuing in the Daodejing in chapter 35. I'll go ahead and share the screen. All right. And we'll go ahead and just kind of jump right into this. This is kind of a fun little chapter. Starts off, it says, everyone is drawn to those who keep to the one, for there lie rest and happiness and peace. And I'm kind of breaking this particular chapter into two different translations. So this is the first half, and it's the Feng English translation. But a couple things here we want to kind of notice. One is this idea of rest and happiness and peace. And if we think about this in the context of the Warring States period, we can see how this would be something that would be maybe at the top of most people's minds. We've seen a lot of late in the world in terms of conflict and violence and the kinds of really horrible and desperate situations that can create. And you can imagine how there would just be a longing for that rest and that peace and even some kind of happiness. So here, one of the things that's being identified then is that when a ruler, or it could even be just at an individual level, keeps to the one, that it draws people to them. And of course, one of the claims that the Taoists are making here is that when we learn how to actually live out what we're learning from the Tao in terms of these patterns, this way of the world is, and that we bring our actions into alignment with that, into harmony with that, then things are going to more naturally work. The Taoist critique is that what's happened in that Warring States period, the reason everything went so chaotic is there was so much effort to try and get people to conform to particular ways of being that were maybe beneficial for those at the top, but maybe not beneficial for life in general. And that's where all the resistance comes from. That's where the striving's coming from. That's where the competition and the violence was coming from. And so their statement is that when you come across somebody who's actually in alignment with Tao, they're actually living that out. It can't help but attract people to it. And I think we've kind of expressed this a little bit in the past where we have maybe come across people, they might not identify themselves as Taoist or anything along those lines, but maybe they seem to have a great ability to kind of welcome, to be present with you, to truly feel like you're being seen, and that they're very accepting. And how much that maybe inspires us to want to be like that with others, but also that we enjoy being with them, that we're attracted to that. And in that presence, we can have maybe even that sense of rest, like, oh, I can just be myself. I can feel like I don't have to be on guard. And of course, for a lot of us, that can be a very enjoyable experience and maybe even a peaceful experience. And we could think about how this could get applied in a lot of different contexts in our life, whether it's, work or family or, lots of different directions. Here, of course, it's being applied to, more of a governing perspective. And we can think or daydream about what it might be like if the ones that were actually in charge of ruling our country or any of the countries around the world actually were to try and strive for this. What kinds of things might be different? What might life be like? So this chapter doesn't get a lot into how one gets to be in that place, but it is more or less talking about what the effect is, but also there's going to be an interesting contrast that we see. Also want to just bring in a quick note about this. So when it says those who keep to the one, the more literal translation is those that grasp the great vision or image. And the idea here is that there's a way that is presented or observed when the Taoists are trying to understand and look at the nature of reality, how these patterns work, and so forth. And so there is a vision that this then creates, or an image of what could be. And so for an individual to grab hold of that, then is how it's trying to talk about incorporating that into their life. And one of the ways that it talks about this is the Chinese word "da," as in the Daodejing. And as we've looked at before, this has a lot to do with how the Tao gets lived out. And one of the examples of this is things that are in nature. They automatically kind of naturally just mirror the way of Tao because that's just in their nature. It's the humans that have the unique capacity to envision doing something contrary or attempt to try and do something contrary. So we have that unique space where we have to work at bringing our thoughts and actions into alignment with and I would say bringing our intentions into alignment, because ultimately the way that things are isn't, we can't actually go outside of that, right? We might not like the idea of gravity, but there's no way to just like violate gravity. The only way we can do things like fly is that we learn how to work with it. And so this is kind of more the agenda, is how do we bring our intentions in alignment so that we're not constantly being frustrated, but that we're actually more successful in what we're attempting to do because we're working in harmony with what is, as opposed to trying to force through what we think should be. So maybe I'll just pause there for a moment and see if there was any thoughts on this opening of the chapter. Have you had people in your life that you've come across that have brought about this kind of experience?
How does this square with being a hermit? If everybody's attracted to you, it might make it kind of hard to be a hermit.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting thing about Taoism, is it's not an escapist or an ascetic type of philosophy. It's definitely one where we are where the idea is that the sage is actually engaged with the community. Um, I think a while back we went through chapter 27, and it was dealing more specifically like with what the role of the sage was, and it was definitely in how to engage with other people, how to help them.
Does this mean the popular kids in school keep to the Tao?
That's an interesting question, huh? So I think there's going to be goals and ideals that people have in their minds that sometimes, especially when we're young, we just inherit from, our community or the TV or whatever. And when that image of what the quote unquote good life is presented, and we see other people who are maybe mirroring that to us, that can cause us to be attracted to them. Whether or not we would consider this being an accurate representation of the Tao is a whole nother story. So we can be attracted to and become desirous of all kinds of things that aren't maybe necessarily good for us, or good for the society as a whole, or even really in alignment with Tao, if we've kind of adopted some desires about our world that are not consistent with that. And this is actually a really good tie-in, Dane, to where this chapter goes next, because it's not that the Tao, or one who's grasped the vision of the Tao and lives it out, is the only thing that can be appealing or attractive. And I think the main contrast here with this idea of rest, happiness, and peace is going to be thinking about the context of warring states period. But let's say you're not in a warring states period. Let's say you're in a time of relative affluence, then there's going to be a lot of potential distractions. Or even in a situation where, there is conflict, there can be an attraction to, wanting to be on, let's say, the winning side or the controlling party, because there we might find, safety or such. I did a pretty lengthy study through the book of Revelation in the Bible at one point, and it's a very interesting study about how the early Christian community was trying to maintain its identity in the midst of the Roman Empire, with all of the challenges that came with that in terms of the conflict of values. And one of the biggest ways it described the challenge of that for the Christians was not that the Romans were coming and attacking them and hanging them out to dry kind of a situation, so much as it was the lure of prosperity and security that was drawing them away from their community values. That was the biggest struggle that they had. So lots of things can tug at us, and some things can be more than others. And part of that's going to be based off of what kind of vision of the life that we think of in more ideal terms, where does that come from? Is it something that we've just kind of inherited in modern day terms? Did it come through the media, through TV, or did it come, through our parents? Did it come from, a religious upbringing or some other context? Whatever we have adopted internally as that vision, where we see that modeled out is what we are going to be attracted to, or the thing that we chase after. So the degree that we develop a taste for, let's say, the way of Tao and what that looks like in terms of this balance and this harmony with the way things are, then when we see those things modeled, those will be attractive to us. And otherwise it could be something else, right? Maybe the rock star lifestyle or something else.
Bread and circus.
Bread and circus. Yes, exactly. Let them eat cake. All kinds of awesome examples from history.
I think that had a different meaning. Let them eat cake means something different than bread and circus.
That's true. It had more of an idea of the aristocracy not understanding the plight of the poor beneath them, and their rebellion and their struggle. But it's I think also the influence that we have between the different classes and how there's an inability to understand sometimes each other in many different ways. But yeah.
I thought bread and circus referred to the games at the Coliseum to
Oh
keep
yeah.
the populace numbed out and um,
Distracted.
distracted. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Kind of mixed a few things together there. Sorry for the confusion. But I think we can kind of see some of the interesting things that are getting teased out here in terms of presenting an image of what one maybe it's being offered as what one should desire. And the shoulds are always interesting once you get into those, because now we've kind of moved into more of a subjective argument. But this is, I think, where the Taoists kind of come down on this is we want to first strip away all the inherited shoulds so that we can see more clearly what is. And once we see what is, then that can help to inform our subjective decisions about what we should do. So they would say, once we've kind of cleared away all of these other cultural influences and we're able to look at what is the nature of reality, what is the nature of life just as it is, then they have made the observation that it makes sense for us to find ways to work in harmony with what is, because when we try to force things differently, that brings about resistance and suffering and all kinds of other issues that we don't want. So this would be how they arrive at their should, but there's lots of shoulds on offer to humans. All right, we'll go to the next section here. It says music and food can allure passersby to stop, but Tao coming out of the mouth is tasteless. I'll just pause there for a second because I think this is almost kind of comical. It's like, oh yeah, there's things out there can definitely entice people, but you start talking about the Tao and it's like, it's boring. It's tasteless. Uh, this makes me just smile when I think about it. Uh, as somebody who likes to talk about philosophy and talk about things like naturalism or physics, this can be a really common response where frequently people are much more interested in, uh, as Dane was saying, the bread and circus, uh, but not so much interested in having the challenging thoughts or the deep thinking. It can seem dry and boring. Um,
I thought people were drawn to the Tao.
this is really funny, right? But I think what's
Yeah,
being,
who would have thought the Tao was a comedy?
yeah, but what's happening here, I think, is that they're saying, the problem is you're trying to tell somebody about it. That what attracts them is when they see it lived out, right? And what's also interesting is, music and food and why those can be alluring in terms of, the sounds and the smells aren't necessarily bad things. As we brought up a moment ago, that the classical Taoism isn't an aesthetic movement, whereas aesthetic, excuse me, that where one is trying to withdraw from experiences or desires. It's meant to enjoy these things. So we have to kind of tease out a little bit about what's going on here in terms of why they're making this contrast. And definitely this idea of it coming out of the mouth, I think, is key, especially since we just saw that one who is, grasp that vision or grasping to the one draws people to them. Right. So we've got that contrast of how are they being drawn? It's not because they're just talking, but there's something about how they're living or the way that they're doing what they do that has become attractive. And maybe part of the reason why it's difficult when they're trying to verbalize it, as we see in the rest of the section here, it says it can't be seen, it can't be heard. It's very abstract in a sense. It's very ephemeral and maybe not ephemeral, it's not the right word, but it's ethereal, very difficult to try and get a handle on it. Um, but it says once you get an idea of what's going on here and you realize how you're using it, it can never be exhausted. It's like this infinite source of either meaning or context, direction, way of being in life that is much more satisfying. As it said up above, you've got that rest, you've got that peace, you've got that happiness. So it has a lot to offer, but someone can't get it if they're just coming about it from hearing about somebody talk about it. It needs to be something that's more experienced, is part of what I think is happening here with this part of the chapter. Anybody have some other thoughts on this?
It just
When I
reminds
hear
me
somebody
of
talk
like
about the
people.
Tao, I laugh.
Sorry, go ahead, Dane.
I said when I hear somebody talk about the Tao, I laugh. It's a
So
reference to a
Okay.
future
you laugh
passage.
about me all the time?
Oh,
Because
Jim.
it's because when the wise man hears the Tao, he follows it. When the normal man hears the Tao, he wonders about it. When the fool hears the Tao, he laughs.
Mhm.
Hmm. It's reminding me, I can't remember what chapter it was, but it was one of the first few. But we were talking about how like people don't like to be told to do something. They don't like to be obviously convinced. But if you can set an example and like show a better way, then they're more likely to tag along.
Mhm.
And I never try to like convince people of anything because that's an uphill battle, I think. I'd rather just show them like what I do if I'm trying to convince them to like be better or be more accepting. Like then I accept them really fully and show them like if you did this for other people, then you could make them feel better without actually saying those things. So that's what it's reminding me of.
Yeah, it's kind of like when someone will say, don't do, or do what I say, not what I do.
Yeah.
It's kind
My
of like
dad used to say that.
the resistance to that whole thing, you know?
Yeah.
So some of the stuff is the things that we were just talking about. The idea that talk is cheap, it's not enticing, it's not the way that you're going to, in a sense, win the argument. That ultimately, for any of this to be worth anything, it needs to be exemplified. It needs to be lived out and done in such a way that it does entice, like the food or the music, that it offers something that people are desirous of, or helps to paint that way of looking at the world, that they can see the benefit of going that direction. And we talked a little bit about the food and the sounds or the music. You know, is this meant as a distraction, or is this an example of the simple pleasures, things that should be enjoyed? I think we can kind of look at this from both directions. Definitely, the idea, having more of that natural and harmony approach, is going to be that the sounds and the food are things that should be enjoyed. Maybe we need to pay more attention to those things in order to have that experience of life that is fuller, regardless of what kinds of other things are going on around us. Taking time to notice and really reflect on the good things can do a lot to shift our disposition and our experience of life. But I think there's also the idea of distraction, that there's other things that can catch the eye that simply talking about the Tao can't accomplish. So there's, in a one sense, I think the living out of the Tao is then becomes like the food and the music. But on another hand, I think we can look at the alternative options of the food and the music as from the perspective of the distraction. So I wanted to take a little bit of time looking at some of the options that we have with that distraction. So this is just a list of some things that I had just kind of brainstormed about, but there's probably others we can explore, of what kinds of things would be distracting, especially if we're thinking about this from the context of governing or rulership. And, somebody who is going to be enticing but is not following the way of Tao, what are going to be the types of things that would be enticing to somebody? What is going to be the food and the song? So clearly one of the ones that is very frequent is this idea of charisma. So there can be very charismatic leaders that are horrible in terms of thinking about humanity and what it means in this world. And we've seen, unfortunately, many examples throughout history of people that were very charismatic leaders that led people down a very horrible path. So one of the things that needs to be considered is this idea of charisma. Also, the illusion of security. And this has kind of come up a couple of times in the Daodejing already, where we rightfully are concerned about safety and security and are looking for ways that can offer that. But at the end of the day, we also have to recognize that mostly it's an illusion, but we're still very much tempted by those that can offer something that claims to have that security or that peace. And oftentimes that can be something that can tempt us to go beyond the values that we might normally have in order to achieve those, that we're willing to sacrifice certain things that are maybe good things in order to try and get to that security. The other thing, and this is a lot of what Dane brought up with the bread and circus, is the attention to the superficial, finding ways to distract, finding ways to get us to pay attention to things that have no real value, but they occupy our time so that we're not taking time to think about whether or not we should be worried about these things. Getting whether it's the bread and circus or, modern day. And I don't even know what this is exactly because I haven't ever watched it, but I hear things talked about a lot as far as the Kardashians or something like that. And it sounds like it's just some kind of reality TV show that doesn't really have much to do with anything. But clearly it takes up a lot of people's times because it comes into prominent social discussion in a lot of social media or talk shows or other things. Um, and then I think maybe one of the chief distractions is when we have not either been taught how to successfully think about our mortality. Successful is not the right word, but in a productive way to understand or how to incorporate our mortality into our perspective of life. We can be very strongly tempted to find options that can give you an escape from having to deal with that, whether it's promise that of immortality or afterlife or many different things that can be used. Getting back into the idea of safety and security as well. All those things can be a powerful motivator if we haven't come to terms with our mortality, that again can cause us to maybe lessen our values or adopt different values or fall in line with a different way of thinking. So this would be just kind of some of the preliminary things I was thinking about in terms of how different types of leaders offer the distraction that can seem like it's answering our concerns, but maybe are leading us in the wrong direction. What are some ideas that you guys have here, maybe additional distractions or how these are dealt with or how we wrestle with these same things in our own context?
Well, we have the concept of hijacking the dopamine pathway,
Mm,
which is what all kinds of apps and social media sites are explicitly designed to do.
yeah, for sure.
Thinking job, having a job and chasing security through a job. Give an example of that.
So you're thinking in terms of where we might be tempted to compromise because we have to keep the job because we need the money to survive.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes it's not even about, our own morals or ideals or, things we want to adhere or uphold. It's just compromising our own security for other security. Because, if you don't have a job, you don't have any income, all of your other securities go down the drain, right?
Hmm. Yeah, it brings up a real interesting dilemma that we are all kind of integrated into stuff that requires other people. Right? None of us are an island where we can just, self-sufficient and don't have to worry about anything. Even if you're somebody that has billions of dollars, you're still dependent on, how does the technology or whatever you're taking advantage of to keep things running, or uh, just the whole world system, really, in terms of goods and um, resources. It's all integrated. Whether you have a bunch of money or not, everything is still connected. It just feels like you can be more independent of other people if you have more of the resources, basically meaning you don't have to be concerned about what other people think. Where it's kind of an interesting situation, right? So if you're in a heavily dependent situation with other people, then you're much more cognizant of how we don't upset the apple cart, of how we maintain the peace, of how we keep things flowing, because we all need each other. We're all dependent and trying to accomplish this goal or get out of this mess or keep the family business running or whatever it is. But if we have a ton of money, then there's all kinds of people that we can just simply dismiss or not pay attention to because we don't care, right? We don't have to care. And that's an interesting dilemma that we find ourselves in modern society too, chasing after that wealth in order to get to that value of independence, which is really freedom from having to care about what other people think. Interesting value that we have. But it's a strong one. I mean, even in myself, where I challenge myself on that all the time, it's still a real powerful draw of, it'd be nice not to have to worry about that. But is that a good thing? I don't know. So if that's a comprehensive list of the distractions, maybe we could flip it around the other direction. And if we're talking about how this might get lived out, or how examples of what this looks like that maybe you've come across that you find enticing in a positive way, what do those things look like? And I'm going to go ahead and take us off the screen here so we can see each other.
You mean living it out as in like not having those distractions, or what do you mean?
So the beginning of the chapter, we talked about how people are drawn to individuals that grabbed hold of that vision and lived it out. Have you had experiences of different people, or and it doesn't have to be like we're calling out the person, but people in your life that have drawn you to them because they had such a positive influence?
I think this is where activism lives a lot. And that's where I personally have obviously gone drawn into certain activisms because of seeing people talking and standing up for certain things, and especially doing certain things like attending the protests and attending the rallies and speaking out and giving a voice to people who need it and stuff like that. So I think that was one of the great examples. I would also maybe talk about some, let's say influencers or content creators on the social media that we follow lately a lot. In terms of finding the people that talk about things that are interesting to us, that are, whether it's content in terms of learning and stuff like that, or whether it's about approach to life, like um the people who experience specific things that are interesting to us and change our perspective on things. Like a YouTuber I was following recently went through cancer treatment, and a lot of his perspective obviously changed during that traumatic event, and a lot of the things that he talked about are very, very inspiring to do some changes for myself as well. Is the vlog brother. They also talk a lot about tuberculosis, for example, and how the uh, borders of the world, how the companies of the world, the countries of the world impacting each other in terms of treatment and availability of things. So like a lot of those things, what to fight for and what to be careful, what to listen to, what to give your energy to, and stuff like that. And that it provides a lot of inspiration to at least food for thought, if nothing else, at best to change your own ways to stand up for the cause as well.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I feel similar drawings as you do, Martin, in terms of, the question about like things like social justice and how do we play that out so that there's more of a balanced way of people being able to experience life as opposed to being so lopsided. And certainly also, like you mentioned, somebody going through a life-threatening illness or situation can definitely change your perspective and cause you to think about what actually matters here. It's definitely the Stoic philosophy of memento mori. Remember that your death is meant to help you keep that in mind, even if you haven't gone through a traumatic experience. Keeping it in front of yourself, that yes, we're all mortal, we are going to die. What are we going to do with the time that we have?
I think I've had. Sorry, go ahead, Dave.
Go ahead, Taylor.
I've had like both kinds of people in my life. I think I've had people that are very accepting and they stay that way and they're kind to the core and you love being around them. But then I've had those people that are kind of like leaders and they're really charismatic, but then you find out they're not and they end up in trouble and everything that you thought, like, you know, that you thought they were accepting and you thought they were a good leader and you thought they were helping all these people with all these things, and then all of a sudden it's like, what happened? Like, where is this coming from?
Mm,
um it's kind of shocking. So, and the charisma can really get you. It's crazy how distracting somebody's charisma can really be compared to like who they really are.
for sure.
The person who most comes to mind for me when you talk about this, Jim, is a guy named Daniel Schmachtenberger. I
Mm,
don't know, maybe you know him. He used to live in San Diego. He moved away not that long ago. He's
another beardy person.
okay, yeah, so you do know him. Yeah, he's if you know him, then you probably know that like he's one of the things about him is extremely humble. Um and he's what stands out to me, well, what stands out to a lot of people is like you see him and you don't think there's much to him just to look at him, but then you hear him say two sentences and you realize he's like one of the smartest people who ever lived without trying to be or trying to show off or anything. You just like that's what most people would notice right away. But what really stands out to me about him is the non-judgmentalness. Like he's one of the most extremely non-judgmental people I've ever met. You can just tell that like where other people would want to make an enemy image out of somebody and criticize and other people, like if you just listen to hear him talk about other people, he understands the problems, he understands the situation, he understands what people are going through, understands why they do the things they do. And um I mean, he is really intelligent, but to me, he's really intelligent, really humble, but also just one of the most non-judgmental people that I've ever met, coming from a place of understanding what's really going on.
Mm, yeah. Yeah, I think I'd have a similar impression of him as well. I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to um, kind of the matchup between classical Taoism and more of a naturalist view in the sense of how the determinism plays the role. Because for me, that's been one of the great liberators in terms of thinking about judgment of other people and how to have a perspective that allows for much more of a constructive approach to looking at the issues that we have, whereas just kind of having the judgments about people and on if they would just behave better doesn't really help in terms of how to address most of the problems that we're dealing with in society.
I'm also thinking about our families and our parents, right? And when we grow up, a lot of people influence us in terms of how do we form ourselves as humans, or they form us without our knowledge, I guess, depending on how early you talk about. Um, but I guess what Taylor mentioned later on, like you just later on when you become your own person, you get to assess whether or not they have the best intentions for you in mind, or if they're best intentions for themselves. That's how we end up with families who are split up. And so we end up with cutting off the toxic brothers and parents and such. And we uh, see what to do or what not to do, perhaps. Yes, also a good example of that.
Yeah, there's definitely an interesting part of our development where we start to maybe have some questions about the way of the world that we inherited from our family and our immediate culture, and start to ask bigger questions about, is this the only way? And sometimes we continue to agree with it, and sometimes we depart from it. And the departing from it can be very challenging, very painful, especially if other people are not happy about us doing that. Well, guess we didn't have a whole lot of talkative people today.
I know I'm like mostly sitting here just like churning it. I'm like, what else? Because I think about acceptance and I think about how now, like, especially with political parties or you see it on social media or really anything, like it's always me versus you. It's not, let's sit down and connect and have a conversation. Even if we don't agree, we can still, even if we don't agree on how to do something, we can agree that we have the same goal, right? Like we want our people to thrive. We want our communities to thrive.
Do they though?
Hopefully. I think most people want their friends and family and themselves and their communities to be happy and healthy and successful. I think most of the disagreement comes in when we start to talk about how.
Yeah.
And I think if more people were open to acceptance and having conversations, regardless of whether you agree on how to get there, then we would have more connections and we would have more compassion and still hold those connections and compassion even when you disagree, which I know is not always possible. Like going back to the family thing, I have family members that I've cut off and I have family members that I've had compassion for and remained connected to despite disagreement. And obviously I would rather the latter, but it's hard. I think a lot of people just jump immediately to like, you don't agree with me, I'm not accepting you.
I think a lot of that, so much of our world right now has been framed as the differences, everything, even small things, is almost like existential issues, that there's not really room for compromise. And this would be another area that I found really refreshing in terms of going through like classical Taoism, is this humility of recognizing that we never know everything about any story. So we can't be too dogmatic in our judgments on it because we simply don't have all the information and never can. But also the idea of harmony versus conformity. And I think our poison right now is everything's about how do we get somebody on our side? How do we get somebody to conform to this way of thinking, as opposed to finding ways to weave the differences together in a way where the differences are important to bringing out, that harmony, that sound, that flavor that benefits from the difference, as opposed to resisting the differences. Interesting book, too. Jonathan Haidt, a neuropsychologist, wrote a book called The Righteous Mind. And he does a really good job of looking at the different kinds of moral centers that people have in their brains and how they get activated differently between people who tend to come from more of a conservative towards more of a liberal perspective. And it's very interesting. Definitely opens up a lot of avenues for having more of an understanding of the different sides. It's a little bit of a not totally technical read, but it's definitely a good read.
Yeah, I think that can be very distracting too, like just the clash with other people instead of focusing on the goals. Like the clash itself can also be very distracting.
Yeah. I find for myself, and probably everybody, part of our evolutionary makeup is to be able to make very quick judgments about people based on things that oftentimes we're not even cognizant of, that I try to pay attention to when I have those initial judgments, and then let's say there's ongoing engagement with that person, and it turns out to be entirely different. I really try to focus on remembering that mismatch between that initial judgment versus reality, because that helps me in the future when I find myself through laziness or whatever, just habit, falling into these categories of, oh yeah, this person is that way or this person is that way, to be more open to the present moment and how they're actually going to behave versus how I've already kind of put them in a box. And that's proved to be a pretty helpful thing. Just really
It's
recognize.
hard.
Hmm?
It's hard not to do that, but also I was listening to a podcast the other day and they were talking about how actually gossip and like snap judgments like that are like an evolutionary thing
Hmm.
because it's a way of telling like your your village that somebody is not safe. Like they're gonna hurt you, or like, hey, there's a saber-toothed tiger over there, like by the pond. It's a way of spreading information as a means of safety.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's definitely has good reasons why they come up, but they're not always accurate.
Oh
So
yeah.
it's just recognizing, paying attention to, in my case, when I get it wrong, and really noticing that so that it helps me then to have, yes, I get that initial inclination that you can't really avoid. It's going to pop up, but then I have more of a space to recognize that something just popped up and this might not be accurate or it might be accurate, right? There's definitely dangerous people that you have to be careful of. So it's not that we just have to embrace everything, but we can be more open to making sure that we haven't prejudged or pre-contained somebody.
Mm, books and covers.
Yeah. All right. Well, maybe we'll bring it to a close for today. I want to thank you for joining today. And if you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of our Zoom discussion or to join us in person, if you happen to be in the Southern California area, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe and you'll get our newsletter that has the latest videos as well as invitations to our different events. All right, guys, take care.
Thanks,
Bye,
Jim.
thanks, Jim.